Welcome to Crime Show. At the center of this heartbreaking story were three individuals: John Reynolds, a former Marine and dedicated husband; Emily Reynolds, his caring yet often isolated wife; and Father Mark, a captivating and enigmatic priest. Their seemingly normal lives became intertwined in a web of lies and tragedy, leaving a permanent scar on the peaceful town of Meadowbrook. John and Emily Reynolds appeared to have the ideal marriage. After more than a decade together, they had built a life filled with stability and respect. John, an ex-Marine with a chest full of medals, was highly regarded for his discipline and honesty. Emily, a stay-at-home mom, was adored for her warmth and her active involvement in local community activities. Their marriage was admired by those around them, serving as a foundation of their social circle. But behind the picture-perfect exterior, Emily often felt the pangs of loneliness. John had recently taken on a new job that demanded long hours, leaving Emily home alone for much of the time. As a security consultant for a prestigious firm, John was constantly traveling, and his work consumed nearly all his time and energy. Emily was left to handle the household and care for their two children on her own, but her days were increasingly marked by longing and solitude. Even though she busied herself with community events and activities at their local church, the absence of her husband was deeply felt. Father Mark was the new priest at St. Mary's Church, and he quickly became a beloved figure in Meadowbrook. His sermons were passionate and magnetic, drawing more people to the pews every Sunday. He had a way of connecting with the congregation, offering solace and understanding to those who sought him out. To Emily, Father Mark seemed to understand the silent struggles she kept hidden, and she found herself increasingly drawn to his comforting words and presence. She began volunteering more frequently at the church, hoping to fill the growing emptiness that John's frequent absences had left behind. As John's time away from home increased, Emily's bond with Father Mark grew stronger. She found in him a listening ear, someone who would hear her without judgment or distraction. Their conversations became more personal, more intimate. What began as simple exchanges about faith and life slowly deepened into something much more significant. Father Mark, behind his calm and kind demeanor, had his own ambitions. He saw Emily's vulnerability and moved closer, drawing her into his orbit. Rumors of a scandal started quietly, as they always do. Meadowbrook was a small town, and keeping secrets was no easy feat. Yet John, oblivious to the deepening relationship between his wife and the priest, remained focused on his demanding job. He took pride in his work, providing security strategies for high-profile clients and ensuring their safety in an increasingly dangerous world. What he didn't realize was that the greatest danger was looming within his own home. Father Mark, who had arrived in town as the new priest, quickly won over the parishioners with his fiery sermons and gentle guidance. He had a unique ability to offer comfort to those in need and seemed to genuinely care for everyone who came to him for advice. Emily, who was always deeply spiritual and committed to the church, found herself more and more drawn to the warmth and charm of Father Mark. The two spent increasing amounts of time together, and Emily began to seek his counsel regularly. What started innocently enough soon began to blur into something more. Emily, who had been struggling with feelings of isolation due to John's frequent absences, sought refuge in the church. She felt that Father Mark understood her in ways that no one else had, and their conversations became less about faith and more about personal matters. With each passing day, Emily felt a deeper connection to him, a sense of being truly seen and valued. Father Mark, captivated by Emily's openness and vulnerability, found himself drawn to her as more than just a parishioner. Their encounters, once open and public, began to take place in the quiet, hidden corners of the church. The lines between priest and parishioner blurred, and an unspoken tension built between them. The forbidden nature of their growing attraction, a priest falling for a married woman, added a layer of danger and excitement to every shared glance and whispered conversation. As their relationship intensified, they began to meet outside the church under the guise of spiritual counseling. But it was clear that what they were sharing had become something far more complex. Emily and Father Mark's relationship deepened, and soon they began taking long walks through the peaceful countryside surrounding Meadowbrook. Their conversations were filled with laughter and shared secrets, drawing them closer together. What started as an emotional connection quickly turned physical. Light touches between them, fingers brushing or hands lingering, sparked intense desires they could no longer resist. Before long, they were entangled in a passionate affair, meeting in secret and surrendering to their overwhelming attraction. The thrill of crossing forbidden boundaries intensified every moment they spent together, their hearts racing in the shadows, fueled by the excitement of forbidden love. Each secret meeting was charged with the weight of what they were doing. The awareness that they were breaking sacred vows added an intoxicating element to their romance. Every whispered word, every stolen touch was filled with the taboo nature of their relationship, making the affair feel even more dangerous and irresistible. But the burden of keeping such a secret weighed heavily on them. Father Mark and Emily knew that their actions crossed lines they could never uncross, yet they couldn't pull themselves away from each other. As their affair grew more intense, it consumed them both. They became careless, meeting in increasingly risky places and leaving behind subtle clues that hinted at what was happening between them. Emily's behavior started to change noticeably. Once steady and calm, she became distant and restless, often evasive when speaking with John. Her mind seemed elsewhere, and John couldn't help but notice her coldness toward him. Father Mark, too, was deeply affected. His sermons became more fervent and passionate, reflecting the inner turmoil he was battling. He wrestled with his vows, torn between his guilt and his inability to break things off with Emily. The affair brought him a kind of excitement and fulfillment he had never felt before, and he was unwilling to let it go. John, who had been completely unaware at first, started to sense that something was off. Emily's late nights at the church, the secretive phone calls, and her sudden distance from him raised suspicions. As time went on, he began piecing together the signs of Emily's betrayal. The life he had known, stable and predictable, was starting to crumble beneath him. Meanwhile, the small town of Meadowbrook was not immune to rumors. The subtle changes in both Emily and Father Mark had not gone unnoticed. In a close-knit town where everyone knew each other's business, gossip spread quickly. The scandalous whispers about their relationship grew louder, becoming the subject of hushed conversations and suspicious glances among the townsfolk. As the affair continued, a darker truth began to surface. Father Mark had a history of inappropriate relationships. It soon came to light that Emily wasn't the first woman he had seduced under the pretense of offering spiritual guidance. Several other women, once captivated by his charm and charisma, came forward with stories of secret meetings and illicit affairs. These revelations cast a sinister shadow over Father Mark's relationship with Emily. The priest, once viewed as a moral pillar of the community, was now seen with suspicion and disdain. As more people became aware of his actions, the desperation in Father Mark grew. Father Mark became increasingly frantic to protect his secrets, and this desperation led him to a terrible decision. One evening, David, a regular churchgoer, witnessed something he wasn't supposed to. He caught Father Mark and Emily in a compromising position, kissing inside the confessional booth. David, shocked by what he had seen, threatened to expose their affair unless Father Mark came clean to the congregation. Terrified of losing his reputation and his hold on the community, Father Mark quickly devised a plan to silence David. Father Mark convinced David to meet him in the church's bell tower one evening, under the pretense of having a private conversation. It was a dark, quiet night, perfect for the sinister plan Father Mark had in mind. The tower was high and isolated, an ideal place for what he was about to do. As they stood near the edge, David became more insistent, his voice rising as he demanded that Father Mark confess to his actions. But what David didn't see was Father Mark subtly nudging him closer to the edge of the tower. In one swift and brutal motion, Father Mark pushed David over the edge. David's eyes widened in shock, his arms flailing wildly as he struggled to grab onto something to stop his fall, but there was nothing. His scream cut through the still night air, and it seemed like an eternity before his body finally hit the ground with a sickening thud. The impact was horrifying. Blood pooled around him, and his body lay twisted in unnatural angles. Father Mark stood at the top of the tower, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight of David's lifeless body filled him with a mixture of horror and relief. His secret, for now, was safe. With no one around to witness the crime, Father Mark hurried down from the tower. Under the cover of darkness, he dragged David's body to the church basement, hiding it beneath old, forgotten church items. His hands shook with fear, but he knew he had to remain composed. He couldn't afford to arouse any suspicion. In the days that followed, Father Mark continued to conduct Mass as if nothing had happened. He played the part of the concerned priest, offering comfort to those in the congregation who noticed David's sudden disappearance. With the body hidden, the mystery of David's vanishing remained unsolved, for now. As time went on, Father Mark tried to carry on with his life, as though nothing had happened. The questions about David's sudden disappearance gradually faded, and people in Meadowbrook stopped asking about him. Father Mark maintained his role as a spiritual guide, offering hope and advice to those who came to him. But inside, he was tormented. Every unexpected sound or shadow made his heart race, a constant reminder of the deadly risk he had taken. Though he knew the gravity of his actions, he convinced himself that he had no other choice. Emily, unaware of the terrifying lengths Father Mark had gone to, continued their affair. She sensed something different about him, a shadow that seemed to linger around him. But whenever she asked, he dismissed her concerns with a smile. Father Mark tried to convince himself he could move on, that he could bury his guilt just as he had buried David. But the weight of his crime pressed down on him, making each day more difficult. His every moment was a struggle to maintain the facade of a kind and caring priest. The police investigation into David's disappearance eventually hit a dead end. There were no leads, no suspects, and nothing to tie Father Mark to the crime. Slowly, Father Mark began to believe he had escaped justice. Yet, even as he resumed his normal life, the memory of that fateful night refused to leave him. It haunted his dreams, creeping into his thoughts during the quiet moments of the day. He had silenced David, but his conscience refused to let him rest. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. Meanwhile, John's world was crumbling. The love and trust he had built with Emily over the years now seemed like a distant memory. His wife had grown increasingly distant, lost in her thoughts, and frequently away from home. His suspicions were growing stronger, and John couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One cloudy afternoon, John decided he needed answers. His gut told him to follow Emily, so he did. He trailed her to St. Mary's Church, his heart heavy with anticipation. As he saw her enter the sanctuary, he quietly slipped inside and hid behind the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. From his hidden vantage point, John watched as Emily approached Father Mark. Something about her was different. She was radiant. Her face lit up in a way that John hadn't seen in months. Father Mark stood close to her, too close for John's comfort, and when he gently touched her arm, it sent a wave of fiery anger through John. That moment confirmed John's worst fears. His wife, the woman he had trusted and loved, was having an affair with the priest they both respected. Overcome by a mixture of fury and heartbreak, John couldn't hold back any longer. He leaped from his hiding place, startling both Emily and Father Mark. Emily's face went pale, and Father Mark, always so composed, was visibly shaken for a moment. What followed was a confrontation full of raw emotion, John's voice, heavy with betrayal, echoed through the church as he accused them of their deceit. Every word dripped with the pain of being betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. "How could you do this to me? To us? To our family?" he shouted, his voice breaking with each word. Emily, completely caught off guard and struggling to find her voice, stammered as tears welled up in her eyes. "John, it's not what you think," she tried to explain, but the guilt weighed down her words, making them sound hollow. Father Mark, desperate to calm the escalating situation, raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please, John, listen. This wasn't supposed to happen. It's more complicated than you think," he pleaded, his voice strained with desperation. But John was too consumed by rage to listen. He was overwhelmed by the betrayal, the violation of his trust, and the destruction of everything he had held dear. "Complicated," John roared. "You've betrayed me, betrayed everything we stand for." His fists were clenched, and his body trembled with uncontrollable fury. The tension in the air was thick, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. John, driven by his uncontrollable anger, lunged at Father Mark. The priest, usually calm and peaceful, found himself forced into an act of desperation. He scanned the area, his frantic eyes landing on a large, heavy crucifix near the altar. In a moment of pure instinct, Father Mark grabbed the crucifix. With a sickening thud, the first blow struck John, splitting his forehead open and sending blood spraying across the church. But John, fueled by rage, charged again. Terrified, Father Mark swung the crucifix with all his might. Each swing was more brutal than the last. Bones cracked and flesh tore as the blows rained down. The altar was soon covered in blood as Father Mark, gripped by panic, struck again and again. The final crushing blow shattered John's skull, leaving him lifeless in a pool of blood. The sacred crucifix, now dripping with John's blood, fell from Father Mark's trembling hands. The floor was slick with crimson, and John's body lay broken, a grotesque shadow of the man he once was. His face was nearly unrecognizable, caved in from the brutal force of the attack. Father Mark stood over the lifeless body, panting heavily, surrounded by the horrific aftermath of what he had done. His hands, covered in blood and bits of flesh, trembled uncontrollably. Emily, having witnessed the entire violent scene, stood frozen, unable to process the horror she had just seen. Her life, once filled with love and hope, was now shattered beyond repair. She collapsed beside John's body, her sobs filling the church, her grief overpowering her. Father Mark, standing in a daze, looked down at his blood-stained hands, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. The panic set in, and without a word, he fled from the church, leaving behind the gruesome scene of blood, death, and ruin. His flight wasn't just a physical escape from the church. It was an attempt to flee the crushing guilt and the inevitable consequences that would soon follow. The quiet night was shattered by the flashing red and blue lights of police cars racing through the narrow streets of Meadowbrook. Emily Reynolds, distraught and in shock, had made the 911 call, her voice trembling as she reported the horrifying scene she had just witnessed. Father Mark, his clothes soaked in John's blood, fled the scene of the murder, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. The small town that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a maze, closing in on him with every step he took. As the first light of dawn broke over Meadowbrook, the shocking news of John's murder spread quickly. The police arrived at St. Mary's Church and immediately began their search, combing through every corner of the building. What they found deepened the tragedy. A body, twisted and broken, in the church's dark recesses. It was David, the missing churchgoer. His death had been the result of a fall, but now it was clear. Both he and John had met their fate at the hands of the same man. Father Mark, once a respected figure in the community, was now a monster in their eyes. The discovery of David's body left no doubt about Father Mark's guilt. The police meticulously searched the church for more clues, each hidden spot revealing more of the dark secrets Father Mark had kept hidden for so long. Soon, the manhunt for the fallen priest began. Over the police radio, an urgent message rang out. All units, we have a suspect on the run. Father Mark is considered armed and dangerous. Approach with caution. Father Mark moved quickly, ducking into back alleys and taking hidden paths through the town. His mind raced, desperately trying to come up with a plan. He knew the police would be closing in soon, and his only hope was to make it to the dense woods at the edge of town. If he could reach the forest, he thought, he might be able to lose them and evade capture. Detective Miller, a seasoned officer known for her relentless pursuit of justice, led the search. She knew every nook and cranny of Meadowbrook, using her deep understanding of the town to predict Father Mark's next move. Roadblocks were set up at all the major exits, and officers scoured the streets and surrounding areas. Detective Miller was determined to bring the fugitive priest to justice. Father Mark's heart pounded as he neared the outskirts of town. The forest loomed ahead, its thick trees and underbrush offering a sliver of hope for escape. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the distant flicker of police lights, the faint wail of sirens growing louder. With a final burst of energy, he plunged into the woods, his mind swirling with fear and desperation. The forest was dense and disorienting. The thick underbrush pulled at his clothes, slowing him down. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent him into a panic, imagining the police closing in on him. His thoughts became a chaotic mix of guilt and survival. He couldn't shake the reality of what he had done, murdering John, silencing David. His sins felt like a heavy weight on his chest. Detective Miller wasn't far behind, leading a team of officers into the forest, their flashlights cut through the morning fog. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, mingling with the tension of the chase. What was usually a place of peace now felt like a trap, tightening around Father Mark with every passing second. Spread out. He can't have gone far, Miller ordered, her voice steady and determined. She knew they were close. Broken branches and disturbed foliage provided a clear trail, and the dogs, trained for tracking, barked eagerly as they picked up Father Mark's scent. Father Mark's strength began to falter as he pushed deeper into the forest. Exhaustion weighed on him, and his thoughts turned dark. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, the woman who had unknowingly set all these tragic events into motion. The burden of his sins was unbearable, and he started to consider a final, desperate act to escape justice, taking his own life. Suddenly, the barking of police dogs pierced the air, sending a surge of panic through Father Mark. He knew his time was running out. In a blind rush of fear, he broke into a desperate sprint, but his exhaustion clouded his judgment. He stumbled into a small clearing, only to be met by the blinding beams of police flashlights. "Freeze! Put your hands where we can see them!" Detective Miller's voice rang out, firm and commanding. Father Mark, panting and defeated, raised his blood-stained hands into the air. The weight of his actions crashed down on him, and he fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the gravity of what he had done. The officers quickly surrounded him, securing him in handcuffs. The cold metal bit into his wrists, a physical reminder of his guilt. As they led him away, Father Mark's mind spiraled into despair. In a sudden, desperate move, he attempted to take his own life. Lunging toward a jagged rock, he tried to end the torment that plagued him. But the officers were quick to react, pulling him back and restraining him more tightly. His failed suicide attempt only deepened his misery. By the time the sun had fully risen over Meadowbrook, the once serene town was left to witness the dramatic capture of its fallen priest. Father Mark, now in police custody, had sealed his fate through his own dark deeds. The manhunt had ended, but the scars left on the town would linger for years to come. Meadowbrook would never forget the shocking betrayal, the murders, and the devastating impact of a man who had once been their trusted spiritual leader. Father Mark sat in his prison cell, his mind clouded with regret and despair. The trial had been swift, the evidence against him overwhelming. The verdict came quickly: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the iron bars and concrete walls closed in around him, the harsh reality of his situation began to sink in. Every minute spent in that cold, dark cell was a constant reminder of the sins he had committed and the lives he had shattered. In prison, Father Mark found no peace. Each day was a relentless battle with his conscience, a torment that would never let him forget the terrible choices he had made. Any attempts to seek redemption were met with the inescapable truth of his actions. He had betrayed the trust of an entire community, and the weight of that betrayal crushed him every day. The whispers of the other inmates, the isolation, and the knowledge of the pain he had caused lingered in his mind like an endless nightmare. He had once tried to run from justice, but now he had no choice but to face it head-on every single day of his remaining life. Back in Meadowbrook, the community began the slow process of healing. The town was deeply scarred by the events that had unfolded, and it would take time for life to return to any semblance of normal. Father Mark's betrayal was something the people of Meadowbrook would never forget. The church, which had once been a place of comfort and solace, now stood as a grim reminder of the darkness that had briefly taken hold of their town. As the years passed, Father Mark remained haunted by the ghosts of his past. His failed attempt to escape both the police and his own guilt weighed heavily on him. He was forced to live with the consequences of his actions, knowing that he would never find forgiveness or peace. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered this tragic and harrowing story.